Hello everyone. I'm going to just go ahead and start. I'm sure people will be signing in as time goes on. I'm glad to see so many people were able to make it. That's good. I am recording this and it will include the screenshots and the audio. Of course, there's no webcam and you don't need your webcams. If you have your webcams enabled, that won't be necessary because we won't be using them. Okay, so I've gotten a couple of suggestions for what to cover, and so I'm going to start out with some simple, some simple information. The first thing I'm going to start out with is how to install audio and video files into the BioTrace software, and this is true for all the different versions of BioTrace. So it's consistent across all the platforms. So the way I do it is very simply to open a folder in Windows, a File Explorer folder, and navigate to the source of my files, whatever that happens to be, whether it's audio or video files. And so, for example, music. So I have, let's say, a track of some sort of music, and I've navigated to that track. Now, be aware that BioTrace does not read inside of folders, so you can't put a folder of a musical source like this unknown album or a mix that you've created in a folder or whatever you might have. For example, this file, you can't put the folder into BioTrace. You have to put the native files themselves into BioTrace. So you can copy, you can highlight all of these, and you can copy these, and then you can navigate now to the BioTrace folder. So again, back to this PC, the C drive, open the C drive, and navigate to the Nexus 10 folder, for example.
John?
Yes?
We cannot see your screen.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Ah, good to know. That helps. Let's see. Can you see it now?
I can't.
You
There we
cannot
go.
see my screen.
There we go. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry. All right, let's start that over since you couldn't see the screen. Okay, so I'll just have to cut that first part out. Okay, so to place audio or video files into BioTrace, you're going to start with a File Explorer window. You're going to navigate to your source of music, wherever that might be, and you're going to copy the individual files, not the folder, because BioTrace cannot read inside of a folder. So you're going to highlight the files that you want to copy. You're going to copy those, and then you're going to navigate to BioTrace. So again, you're going to navigate to whichever BioTrace version you have, and here's the audio folder within BioTrace. So it's this PC, it's the C drive BioTrace audio. You open up the audio folder and paste those files into the audio folder, and there they are. Now, when you open BioTrace, hopefully this is the right folder. Actually, let's go to a different, we'll go to a signal library. For example, the EEG 1 3-band should have an audio screen, which will show up on my secondary screen. Now there's an audio file that's built into the image, unfortunately, and so I could select a different image. Generally, I would be able to find a feedback options and thresholds setting function that will allow me to change the music. Let's see if I can change the image and get rid of that. Let's see. Let's see, what do I want? We'll just use a water file. Anyway, so if I go to feedback options and thresholds and I indicate that I want to create digitized sound, and I go to edit, then I can find my files that I've just installed wherever they may be, and I can copy those into the middle list, and I can copy a series of those into the middle list so that it'll work through these in sequential order. I can enable some volume feedback functions, which I'm not going to get into in detail right now. And so that gives me that information. So that's where I put in the audio files. And if I want to go into video files, I do the same thing. I find some video files. And whatever video file, could be a movie, could be a slideshow that you've created, it could be just about anything. Again, you're going to copy that, not a folder, but an actual file, and then you're going to navigate back to BioTrace, and you're going to go to the video folder. So now it's C drive BioTrace video. Open the video folder, paste that into the video folder, and now when I go into the video folder in BioTrace, I should be able to see that. And so in the BioTrace window that has the video, for example, this image, and I can select video file by right-clicking in the image, or I can press the V key to get the video file list, and then I can go to the one that I just put in there, wherever it might be, and I can choose that, put it in my selected video list. I don't have to click play. Play just gives me the opportunity to see what this is going to look like. I don't need to click play. I can loop the video file, or I could have a series of videos in this list, and I could have it run through that list by unchecking the loop video file. Loop video file will just replay this first file over and over again, which is fine if you have a short loop and you just want to replay that short loop over and over again. As most of these video files that come with the program are set up to just be continuously looping short video files. But if you have something like a slideshow or a video, a movie that you've put in there, then that's something you're going to want to have as a separate file, or you might have ripped your DVD by chapter, and then you'd put a list of chapters in here in order, and it'll play through this list. And of course, then you would want to deselect the loop video file. Okay. So that's how you change and add video and audio to your files. So I'm going to close this because it's a secondary screen. I did have a question about these buttons along the side here. These buttons are present in a lot of different screens. This happens to be an EEG screen, but if you were to go to the signal library and go to the HRV screens, for example, the HRV basic screen, also you have these buttons along the right-hand side of your screen. And so, for example, if I'm going to play a video, on my secondary screen, if I've got a video playing and I click this change feedback button at the top of this list on the right-hand column, that will bring up the video files folder rather than me having to press the V key or do anything or right-click in the background. There are multiple ways of accessing this same video folder, but one of the ways is to click this change feedback button. The same would be true if I was using, for example, the puzzle display. And so if I've got the puzzle display up on my secondary screen and I click this change, then I can choose a different puzzle. And then it'll run through a different puzzle. And the same is true with the DVD player and other animation. If I have an animation, for example, and I want to change that again, I can click this button to access that. Now, if I am working with audio sources, for example, some of the audio sources start out with the audio feedback already engaged as a part of the video, unfortunately, and because it's designed into the video, you can't change it. And so it's not a very handy way to do things. And so hopefully what Mind Media will do is when you have an audio source, when you click this change feedback button, it'll allow you to change the audio source. That would be my choice, of course. Possibly it'll just allow you to change the image that you're seeing. They are working on the 2017 update, and I just got a new beta version of that, so hopefully it'll be ready for release soon. One never knows. So those were the small things that people wanted to talk about in the HRV training and the buttons. So the next thing people wanted to talk about is from the very beginning, how to record, process, and interpret the data in a 19-channel recording. And so let's start with BioTrace. And right from the beginning, if you go to Signal Library and QEEG, usually I choose this 21 EEG with FFT. So it's showing me 21 channels. It's showing me the 19 channels on the scalp, plus the reference sensors down here at the bottom. These are A1 and A2. And whether they're on the mastoid or on the ears, it doesn't matter. They're still labeled in this particular case as A1 and A2. So I'm going to just load a saved session, a previously recorded EEG from someone. And so this is early on in the process, and the first thing I want to do, I'm going to replay this as though it were a session that I'm actually recording. The first thing I'm concerned about is that I've got a lot of 60 hertz artifact here. As you look along the right-hand column, I can see this peak at 60 hertz in the spectral display, and that is present in pretty much all the sensor locations. And so I've also got a fairly wandering sensor here at, it looks like at PZ, and so there's something wrong there as well. I might want to go in here and check the connections and see what kind of connections I've got. And my connections are just fine. The A1 connection is a little high, and actually there's no connection here at PZ. Now we've got a connection at PZ, but that's really high. So I've got some problems with my connections, and so I've got to go and correct those problems with my connections. And what I'm going to do is actually just scroll past all this period of time that I was working on the connections and get to the point where I have a good connection. So how would I treat a bad connection? I would possibly inject a little bit more gel, although you have to be really careful not to inject too much gel, because if you inject too much gel, you can get a bridging artifact between adjacent electrodes. So what I've done is I placed the cap on the client's head. I've plugged the cap into the adapter onto the amplifier, and with a syringe with a blunt needle, I've injected electrogel into each of the sensors through the small hole at the top of the sensor. I've also injected the same gel into the ground sensor, and I've attached either ear clips or I've used the mastoid sensor for the cap. And I've injected enough gel so that I get contact, but not so much gel that it squirts out to the sides. I go to the signal check electrode contact screen to see if I've got a good connection. And in this case, I've got a 0 value at PZ. But all the other ones are fine. So I go back here and I look at PZ and I say, well, PZ looks like it's got a signal, doesn't it? But the problem with looking at this kind of a recording is that this is PZ connected to the linked ears, and the linked ears also have a little bit of a signal. So if you remember from class, we've got an issue with common mode rejection, where the resulting signal on the computer screen is actually a composite of multiple signals. And so this PZ signal that I have here is really showing me what's happening at PZ in relation to the ears linked together. And so it's to some degree a phantom signal, but how would I know that except for going in here and checking to see if I've got a signal? Well, I don't have a signal at PZ for some reason, even though I did have a signal earlier on. If I go back to the beginning, let's a little past the beginning. It continues to have a bad connection. And even though at the beginning, the very beginning, it had a good connection. So it just kind of changed from a good connection to a bad connection and then no connection at all. So if you see that in your recording and you're seeing that you have a 0 connection here, how do you deal with that? How do you even figure out that you have that? So one of the things you can do is change to a different montage and take the ear references out of the mix, and then you can see each individual sensor by itself. And the problem with that is if I'm looking at PZ, for example, I'm looking at the comparison between CZ and PZ, and when I'm doing that, that gives me both signals. And so if CZ has a connection but PZ doesn't, then I get to see a signal, and it looks like there is really a signal. Sometimes the way to deal with that, the same is true with the bipolar, transverse bipolar montage. Anytime I have 2 active signals and one of them has a signal, I'm going to see real data coming from both of them. So if you have a choice of a common average reference, sometimes that will allow you to see the sensor without any contamination from additional sensors, and that's what we have here. So here we have a common average reference, and that gives us an indication that we've got a flat line at PZ, and so that's a bad connection at PZ. And so that's something we would want to track and keep track of. And to some extent, this is a good montage to use when recording, because then you get to see each individual electrode without the contribution from another electrode. So since that's a bad recording and we're not going to use that recording, we need to look at a different recording. So I can, actually I'm going to move this off of my screen so you don't see the client list. And I'm going to open a different recording. So here we have the beginning of this session, and we don't have anything hooked up, of course. So let's move along until we have actual connections. And you can see we've got a bad signal right there, so we got to correct that. And so once we get past that, we can tab the review and see where we are. And tab back. We can look in our, we can go back to our linked ear reference. We can look in our connection values, and we can replay that. Sorry, it put us back to the beginning, unfortunately, as soon as we changed locations. So we've got good connections in all of those locations. And we got to go back to where we were at the beginning. And you can tab back and forth between, if you're looking at a recording, you can tab back and forth between. So now we're going to start the eyes closed segment of the recording. So what I do is 5 minutes of eyes closed, 5 minutes of eyes open, some eyes closed, eyes open sequences, mental math, possibly some other recording, depending on what I'm doing with the client and what they need. I might do some reading tasks and other tasks. And so here is the eyes closed recording. And we'll do 5 minutes of this. We're looking for lateral eye movement in the frontal eye fields at FP1, FP2, F7, F3, FZ, F4, F8. Those are usually where you're going to see that. We're looking for muscle artifact in the temporal leads at T3 and T4 particularly, but also looking at the occipital locations because you'll see muscle artifact in the back of the neck. And again, we're looking for evidence of 60 hertz artifact here along the right-hand column. And in this particular case, we just have a little bit here at F4, but it's not too bad. And so generally speaking, we have a pretty good recording, a pretty good signal. We've got electrode pop right there. Let's actually back that up. Let's see if we can pause this. Actually, let's see if we can stop it. We are at 9 minutes and 50 seconds. So let's go back to 9 minutes and 50 seconds, or just before that. So this is electrode pop, and what electrode pop is when you have a buildup of charge on one side of the electrode gel sensor scalp interface. So it may be anywhere along that line. Basically between the scalp and the sensor, there might be a bubble in the gel or something like that, and the charge builds up on one side and then it jumps across to the other side and we get this large discharge, but it's only showing up in the one sensor. If there were a field, if it was showing up in multiple sensors, then we might think it's a physiological artifact or possibly even a real physiological event. But in this case, it's just an electrode pop. There's also one over here that's a little bit smaller at T5. But I haven't been noticing a lot of them, so I think the connections are pretty good. And really throughout, we see just a couple of those happening occasionally. If you see them being very persistent, then it would be worth spending a little time to re-prep those particular electrodes to try and get rid of those electrode pops. So once we've done the recording and watched for a lot of eye blink, eye movement artifacts, muscle artifacts, drowsiness artifacts or events, pulse artifacts that you might see when a sensor is over a blood vessel, for example. Those are all possible events that you might see. You are more likely to see pulse artifacts in the temporal electrodes like this one at F8. This is a little bit of a pulse artifact. It's just the pulse wave showing up in the EEG. It's not really a movement or electrical artifact, it's just a physical movement artifact. And so this is going to produce what looks like delta in the resulting recording. So that's something we would have to explain in our narrative report. So we can go back to our review screen and go back to how to export the data. So here I have the eyes closed segment highlighted, and this period between here and here is eyes closed. This is eyes open. This is eyes closed, eyes open sequence, where I'm looking to see if the person has an appropriate alpha response and an alpha blocking response. So I'm doing 15 seconds of each condition. So I'm starting here with eyes closed, and then we go to eyes open, and we're looking for an appropriate alpha response when the person closes their eyes, and then alpha blocking when they open their eyes. So here's eyes closed, here's eyes open. This person does not have a particularly substantial alpha response, and their alpha blocking is not particularly good either. So then we would, and that's just information. It's part of our assessment process, but it isn't something we necessarily know much about right now. So I'm going to highlight this, left click and drag to highlight. I'm going to export QEEG, and I'm going to use the EDF plus format. So I click on EDF plus. I've already selected this period of data, so I'm going to accept that as correct. I'm going to go into my export folder, and then I'm going to give this person a unique identifier of some sort, and then it's going to be saved in this export folder, and then I'm going to go from there. So I do that for each of these segments: eyes open, eyes closed, mental math, and so on, and put all of those into that export folder, and then I can import them into NeuroGuide. And so I'm going to go to NeuroGuide and open up NeuroGuide. And from there, I'm going to open and go to EDF Plus again. So I'm importing from EDF Plus. And I've got an EDF Plus file. Oops. I thought I had an EDF Plus file in there. Where did it go? Yeah, they're in there. Oh, I'm sorry. I already saved them as NeuroGuide files. Anyway, from NeuroGuide, I'm going to I'll just open a different EDF file. From the C drive. Where's my C drive? There it is. And I'll go to BioTrace 32. Let's try this one. And export. Oh, that's interesting. In the new version, they don't have an export folder. How can they not have an export folder? Well, we'll go to the older version. There was our export folder. And here's a test EDF file. And I'm going to go to the hardware location. So this is a Nexus, obviously. This says linked ears. I'm going to leave it alone. It's going to come up with a sample, and I need to at least either tell it the date of birth or give it an age, and we'll give it an age of, let's say 55, and it's a female. We don't need to put in gender or handedness. I would generally give it a unique identifier here. I would tell it that it's eyes closed, and then I would click OK. And so I have this file. I'm going to begin by, in the default mode, I can see everything, including the ear references, but I'm going to probably switch to a different montage. So let me orient you to this screen. Here's the scale at the top here in the left-hand column. That's the scale of this recording. And so this recording is a pretty low voltage recording. And right now it's at 30 microvolts. Now a typical scale might be 50 microvolts. A lot of people like to look at 50 microvolts, but that's not giving us a lot of detail here because it's a somewhat lower voltage EEG. So let's actually bring up our file that is a NeuroGuide file of an eyes closed file. Let's go to the desktop, our course examples, eyes closed. And again, here we have our test case. And so we see we're in our linked ears montage, and our scale is a little bit more appropriate. Let's change it to 75 microvolts. And we see a pretty good example of the EEG represented here. If I got to, for example, a 300 microvolt scale, I wouldn't get enough detail. If I went down to a 25 microvolt scale, I would get so much detail that everything would be running into itself. And so what I want to do is have an appropriate scale for this particular recording, and everybody's EEG is different within a certain range. And so a 75 microvolt scale gives me the ability to see all the detail, but not to have everything running across each other. The next thing I have down is edit time, and I haven't edited this at all yet. And so I don't have any edit time. Here's my list of montages that I can choose. And so I've got the linked ears montage chosen in this particular case. Now at the very bottom here, I've got a display time. And I like to look at it at 10 seconds of display time. The default is 6 seconds. I'm not sure why, but I tend to like to look at 10 seconds because then the wave patterns look a little bit more like I'm used to seeing them. And so once I've clicked in the background here, I can scroll through my data. And the first thing I'm going to do is scroll through my data and see if I can see anything that looks particularly odd or unusual. So right here, I see an eye movement. This is eyes closed. This is a lateral eye movement that takes quite a while to occur. It starts right about here, and it goes up and down. And I can see it here in these frontal eye fields, F P1, FP2. I see it at F3. I see it at F4. I see it at C3 and C4 to some degree, but lesser. And once I get back to O1 and O2, I don't see it much at all. So that's an eye movement, but mostly I've got a pretty good recording here. If I look at O1 and O2 along the left-hand column, I have my list of sensor locations, and they're all linked or referenced to the linked ears. And so I see my occipital sensors where I should be seeing my alpha rhythm, and I can begin to look to see if I have a typical alpha rhythm, and I can count the frequency, how many times the waves occur in a 1 second period of time. So for example, I can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 8.5 hertz, which is a pretty slow alpha frequency for an adult. Let's see how old this person is. 56 years old, almost 57. So that's a pretty slow peak alpha frequency for an adult. I can count the zero crossings, how many times it crosses zero, and that's particularly helpful when I've got sort of mixed frequencies. So here I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, maybe 18, divided by 2, so that gives me about 9 hertz. So 8 to 9 hertz is what I'm seeing so far. Roll along a little farther, and I can count another sequence and see that I'm continuing to get about 8 to 9 hertz in the occipital location. Yeah, 8.5 to 9 hertz is pretty much what we've got. We don't have any real severe deviations from expected values that we can see, at least so far. We have a run of activity here, and it's kind of a mixed frequency event, and it looks like it's showing up in all the locations. If we change the montage to longitudinal bipolar montage, we can see that that activity is really in the temporal and temporal parietal combinations and really doesn't happen up here in the front. The apparent activity up in the front is being contributed by the linked ear reference. Because this activity is actually happening in the temporal areas, the reference is picking it up and contributing it to the frontal sensors. So one of the things to take away from this is never trust what you're seeing on the computer screen, which may seem a little bit problematic, and it is, because a lot of people will just look at the computer screen and they'll say, okay, that's what there is, and I'll run my statistical analysis on this and I'll get information. For example, I could go to the dynamic JTFA, I could choose absolute power, z-scores, and color maps, and I can apply that, click OK, and I run across this and I say, oh my God, I've got all of this frontal alpha. That's not supposed to be there. And I've got frontal beta, and I've got posterior theta, and I've got a bunch of other little things going on here. This is looking pretty bad for this person, all this frontal alpha. And as you can see on these spectral displays, just as I run across this data, if I switch to the longitudinal bipolar montage, I get numbers. I don't get maps, but I get numbers, and I see that in the front, I don't have any abnormal values. I have, it's 1.5 standard deviations, but it's not in some cases, but a lot of it's not even significant. And so we see that it's really not statistically significant at that location. So back to linked ears. So sometimes you can, here's another example where it's showing up as excess theta, and again, that doesn't belong in the front. It's actually a lateral eye movement artifact that we're seeing there. That's what that's showing us, is this lateral eye movement artifact here, F7 and F8 that we get from this lateral eye movement. I mean, there is a little bit of theta-like activity here as well, but most of what we're seeing is eye movement right in this particular spot right here. So this is what we're doing. We're going through this and trying to discern what's really here, what's not here, what's real, what's not real, if there's anything really abnormal, before we do the rest of our assessment. Every time you change anything, it changes the scale, so you got to change it back. But there isn't anything that really jumps out except a bit of a slow posterior rhythm. She's getting a little sleepy here. The little alpha that she had is dropping out. She's dropping into sleep here. And it looks like just normal EEG, but it's not, because she's lost whatever alpha rhythm she had, and she's falling asleep. It's stage 1 sleep, and then she wakes up and her alpha rhythm comes back. And so I would want to not pick those sleepy segments for my data analysis. And so that's definitely a sleepy segment there. So you see how the alpha drops off. And we start getting these waves here. We get some vertex sharp waves like these, which sometimes show up frontally. They're not necessarily in the vertex, although they're typically mostly at CZ. And so we see FZ, PZ, CZ here. We see these vertex sharp waves. And then there's a field. Well, actually, it's probably being contributed. There's also some K complexes Let's see if we can see a K complex here. This is kind of like a K complex. It's like a K lying on its back. And usually you'll see that frontally during stage 1 sleep and also into stage 2 sleep. It's just a waveform that kind of looks a little bit, personally, I don't think that looks like a K at all, but that's what they call it. And then she comes back, and then she wakes up again. And we're back to normal EEG, pretty normal, a little bit slow. So we go back to the beginning, and then we start thinking about, okay, let's select some good data for analysis. Data analysis is always tricky, and depending on who's doing the selection, they might be choosing something, and somebody else will come along and say, oh my God, why did you pick that? That's got all sorts of artifact in it. But this is a relatively clean section. I don't see any lateral or vertical eye movement artifact. I don't see any muscle artifact or swallowing artifact or jaw clenching artifact or anything else that looks unusual or different. And I scroll through, and this may look like it's unusual, but it's actually real EEG. And it's actually pretty clean all the way to here. This is probably a little bit of a lateral eye twitch, so I should avoid that part. Actually, probably back to about there, because it's kind of a little bit of a lateral eye twitch. This is actually pretty good in here. Now you can take small segments of as little as a half a second, and you can take a 10-second segment if you've got a good 10-second segment that's continuous. This is pretty good. Don't be fooled into just taking stuff that looks kind of like low amplitude activity, and then avoid the stuff over here that's a higher amplitude that may seem like you're not sure that it's not an artifact, but it is real EEG, so be sure to select that. Here she's getting a little drifty. Again, just a brief loss of alertness, so I don't want to take that. But this looks pretty good. This is an evoked potential. Probably a noise or something. She heard a noise and she's got an evoked. Actually, it's an evoked response. Evoked potential. Just some little noise or something in the environment, and it probably showed up in the temporal lobes, not in the frontal lobes, but it got referred because it was in the temporal lobes to all the sensors because it showed up in the reference, and so then it got contributed. Now this is real EEG. It's higher amplitude and more a combination of frequencies mixed together. So it might be called a polymorphic wave pattern, where you have a little bit faster activity superimposed on slower activity mixed together, often called polymorphic waves. And we can select across all the way to here. Now, right now we've got 20 seconds of selected data. And so I could run the automatic artifact selection process because I've got enough. So I click Edit, I go to Automatic Editing, and I choose the template artifact rejection method. So I choose all of these and deselect the Z-score method. And I'm going to generate edits. And it has selected 3 minutes and 42 seconds worth of data by doing that. So I'm going to click Close, but then I'm going to actually go through the entire recording to make sure that it hasn't made any gross errors, and include things that it hasn't included that I think are acceptable. EEG. The segments with the blue background and the black underline are rejected. The segments with a pink background and a red underline are selected, and the segments that have a white background are not either selected or rejected. They just don't meet either criteria. They don't match the selections that I made, but they don't match any criteria for rejection either. I can also look over here on the left-hand column, and I can look at my split half and retest reliability numbers to see if I'm making good, consistent selections, and my numbers are all quite good at this point. So I could just accept the segments that it's already selected and go from there, but I really do want to visually inspect this. This is a little bit of a lateral eye movement that it picked anyway, and I didn't really want that. Yeah, I guess I'll leave that one alone. So here we've got F7 and F8. We've got a little bit of lateral eye movement in here that we want to get rid of. And there are quite a few little eye twitches in here. We're probably not going to get rid of all of it. It's, to get any data at all, sometimes you have to accept data that's not perfect. But you want to get rid of stuff that's at least the worst of it. And so I'm seeing this right here. It's very likely it's not problematic, but there is a little saying in electroencephalography, when in doubt, throw it out. But this is clearly some sort of a movement artifact, or because this is at T4, there's some kind of a drifting movement artifact here. It's at T3 as well. It's also at F8. It may be coming back from the lateral frontal sensors. It may be a lateral eye movement artifact that reaches back all the way to the temporal electrodes. So when your eyes move side to side, they produce a very large electrical discharge, and you can actually see it all the way back to the temporal electrodes in some cases. Now, it didn't choose this because the voltage was quite a bit higher than what I had selected for my template, but there's nothing wrong with that EEG. So I'm going to go ahead and select it. This is a little bit of lateral eye movement and some other little mixed stuff, so I'm going to get rid of that. Remember, when in doubt, throw it out. We could be very picky about this and get rid of a lot of this activity. That's not good. That's not good. So every time you do an assessment, you have to go through and visually inspect. Otherwise, if you were ending up... So I got rid of that because of all these artifacts in here. Some of it may be rhythmic delta. So we don't want to get rid of something that's real EEG activity. But for example, I got to think that that's, it's F8, so it's some sort of a little twitchy eye movement going on there. So we're running through this, visually inspecting, trying to pick out the good data and get rid of the bad data. Sometimes it's just a matter of, I'm not sure about that, but in an excess of caution. And because I've got 3 minutes and 22 seconds of data and I only need 2 minutes, I'm going to be more picky, and I'm going to throw out more stuff that might be real EEG, just to be sure that I'm not including abnormal EEG at the same time. And I'm going to keep an eye on my numbers over here on my split half and retest. And if I'm starting to get higher numbers, then that means that which I am, by the way, means that my rejections have been correct. That helps me to validate my corrections. Because if these numbers, the higher these numbers are, the better, in the sense of choosing consistent values, consistent representative EEG. So I've got my data, so now I'm going to save this as a NeuroGuide file, and I've already got it in here, so I'll just save it over the previous one. And now I can do various kinds of analyses. The first thing I'm going to do is view the dynamic FFT. Remember, the FFT is the fast Fourier transform. I'm going to look at the absolute power spectrum, and I'm going to include the z-score spectrum. So when I choose that selection, it's going to produce a couple of line graph displays. And this line graph display is absolute power, not statistical at all. It's just absolute power. It's magnitude squared, magnitude being amplitude over time. So the FFT is using 1 or 2 seconds worth of data and processing that, coming up with a spectral display that represents absolute power, the square of the magnitude. And the x-axis is frequency, and the y-axis is voltage in the sense of power, absolute power. And it gives me the opportunity to see where the peak alpha frequency is, or the posterior dominant rhythm, just by looking at this peak. And if I click on this, you will see over here on the left-hand column next to the electrode labels that at the very top we can see here, it doesn't continue to be there, unfortunately, after I stop clicking. If I had 2 mice buttons, that would be good. But if you want to look over there, you can see that it's the peak alpha frequency is at 9 Hertz according to the this analysis, which fits with our visual inspection and our counting of the frequency, that it's somewhere around 8.5 to 9 Hertz or 8 to 9 Hertz. And this is just telling us the maximum and minimum voltage. And so the maximum voltage is this red number over here at 0.1, which tells us that it is 0.1 is the maximum voltage, and down here at T4, it tells us that T4 is, or now in this case, around T4 and T6 are the minimum voltage. Down here in this lower graph, we have the statistical values. So the x-axis is still frequency from 0 to 30 Hertz, and the y-axis is now in standard deviations, in this case from 0 up to 12 standard deviations. So if I click in here at the same location at about 9 Hertz, 8.5 Hertz, I see that I've got a lot of statistical deviations over here. So the numbers in red are statistically significant over here. And you can see that I've got 3 and 4 standard deviations and 5 standard deviations above expected values at that frequency. Now, at each of those locations. Now, what this is telling me is mostly that her peak alpha frequency is slow enough that it's showing up as statistically significant. But also the voltage is high enough that that's causing that as well. If I go up here to about 17, 18 Hertz, I can see that I've also got statistical deviations at 12, 13, 14 Hertz, and so on. Again, statistical deviations of 4 and 5 standard deviations, even some as high as 6 standard deviations, even 8 standard deviations at some of those locations. Same with down here. Now, some of this may be some kind of abnormal activity. At T4, we've got 11 standard deviations. Now, we know from history, this client's history, that she has a history of a motor vehicle accident as a passenger on the right-hand side, where the motor vehicle was struck on the right-hand side. And so we see that at T4, she's got some pretty significant findings here. So we're just analyzing. We're just looking to see what we can see. We're not trying to make any decisions yet. We're just using the tools available to see what's here. The next thing we can do is produce some topographic maps. And so we can select in our report selections these various values, including the traumatic brain injury discriminant function, which we can use because she is over 13 years of age and she does have a history of a traumatic brain injury. And so we can make that choice and we can produce a analysis. And this will give us our brain maps. So here's our test case, and here are the quantitative EEG assessment results. And this is just the summary page, which I'm not going to stop at. So here we have the absolute power maps in 1 Hertz frequency bin. So each of these heads represents 1 Hertz activity, 1 Hertz, 2 Hertz, 3 Hertz, 4 Hertz, and so on. We're looking down at the top of the head. Here's the nose at the top. Here's the left ear. Here's the right ear. And these values are just absolute power values. They're not statistical. And each head has its own scale. So the red color is the highest voltage or power, and the dark blue color on this scale over here is the lowest value. We don't know if it's abnormal. All we know is that it's the highest and the lowest. Now, what we can discern from this is so we've got something here that's kind of consistent at the slower frequencies that's on the right-hand side at about P4 or F4, and that this is something that's interesting to us. We've got some frontal activity here. When we get to 9 and 10 Hertz, we should see the highest voltage in the back, and instead we're seeing it in the front. That may be because of the contribution from the ear references that we talked about earlier. We go through this, we see, again, we're looking to see the distribution of the activity, not whether it's normal or abnormal. We're just trying to see where it is. So we go through the frequencies and all the way up to 50 Hertz. And then we look at relative power, and that's looking at the percentage values. What's the percentage of 13 Hertz at this location? Well, it's about 4.3%. The statistical value of delta at this location is about 12%, and so on. And so if we look for the highest value in this listing, here we go, 9 Hertz. We've got 31% of the data in these locations that are red in the 9 Hertz range. So it's taking up a big percentage of the EEG. If we go back to the absolute power maps, what this is showing us is that it is 12.6, and it's picowatts is the calculation. So then we go to the statistical maps, and the statistical maps are set so the blue value is -3 standard deviations, the red value is somewhere between 2.5 and 3 standard deviations. So the colors start at 1.5 standard deviations. Now we could change that, and in fact it probably would be useful to change that. So we go to color map settings, go to Z-score, and let's set the normal range to, let's set the Z-score range to 4 and the normal range to 3. So anything that's a color is going to be at least 3 standard deviations. And so let's run that same analysis again. So all we're doing is changing the way we look at it. So we go to the 1 Hertz statistical maps, and now we see which areas have excess activity at greater than 3 standard deviations, and the red areas are at least 3.5 to 4 standard deviations. And so we see quite significant deviations from expected values in these frequencies, and possibly indicating the results of the impact injury that this person sustained. So, but let's go back to the normal settings. So you can manipulate the view to display it in a way that helps make sense to you. I think what we'll do is go from 2 to 3.5. And we'll run those again. So this person has a lot of findings, and she certainly has the history to go with it of a right-sided but somewhat frontal impact injury. She's got a lot of excess abnormal activity, especially in the slow frequencies, but also throughout the up to the low beta frequencies and the regular beta frequencies, but not a lot of excess fast activity. So this isn't muscle tension related. Some of this activity may be related to that reference contamination problem that I mentioned. The amplitude asymmetry measure shows the differences in amplitude from one location to another based on compared to a normative sample. Should there be more or less difference between these two locations at this frequency? The scales are down here. Anything that's a line at all, even the thinnest line, is statistically significant. Blue is a decreased asymmetry and red is increased asymmetry. When we get to the z-score coherence maps, we're looking at the same scale. So anything that's at all present, a line is statistically significant, and the thickest line is 3.09 standard deviations, so pretty significant. And we have, for example, if we could parse this out a little bit better, we could see that there's this laterality here. We can see some laterality going from the right anterior frontal, lateral frontal area to the left temporal area, kind of a possible coup contra coup sort of effect, again, which corresponds with history. It's kind of hard to see because you've got so many lines in here, there's so much deviation. The red lines represent hypercoherence and the blue lines represent hypocoherence. And remember that coherence is a measure of the consistency of the phase relationship between two locations at the same frequency. So it's not whether they're in phase or out of phase, it's just whether they are consistently in the same relationship. So high coherence means that these are more consistently at the same relationship than they should be, and hypocoherence means that they are not in the relationship that they should be as much as they are. And so phase lag is just a measure of the phase difference or the phase angle. And again, it's the same statistical scale, so any line at all is statistically significant, showing deficient phase lag in the blue and excessive phase lag in the red. These are just text tables that show the same information as we were seeing in the topographic maps. So we see the absolute power values and then the statistical absolute power values with the numerical values presented here in terms of their correlation between these sensors. Again, the same thing is true with relative power and then the statistical values of relative power and then power ratios. And here we see statistical power ratios. Peak frequency, we'll see if our peak alpha frequency is slow. And I know you probably are having a bit of trouble seeing that. I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to save this. So you go to File, Save Bitmap Graphics Files. We're going to create a folder that's called Images. And then we're going to put all of our image files into there. We're going to call this ECLE for Eyes Closed Linked Ears. We're going to save that. And then we're going to close this and shrink this. And we're going to bring up our image files because then we'll be able to actually see them and make them bigger. So here's our peak frequency display as a statistical value. And so we can see that the peak alpha frequency is slow. by around a standard deviation in most locations, although it's not quite as slow as I would expect it to be. The beta peak frequency is also slow, in some cases by a couple of standard deviations. The delta peak frequency is also slow. Pretty much everything is slow, slower than it should be. So everything's shifted to the slower frequency value. So again, we're just looking to see what's there. We're not making any conclusions yet, although we're starting to build a hypothesis about what's going on with this person and trying to correlate it with her presenting values. Here we are at coherence again, so we have statistical values here and a table of the statistical values in each frequency and the relationship, the sensor relationship. Burst amplitude and burst duration are kind of interesting to look at. So burst amplitude means that when you have let's say you have a burst of alpha activity, is it of higher voltage than you expect it to be? And we see that pretty well correlates with what we saw in the absolute power maps. And burst duration, we've got too much duration here in delta, too little duration here in theta, and in high beta, and in posterior beta, 18 to 25. This is directed communication. Here's the statistical values. Each of these heads represents one electrode location in its relationship with all the other electrode locations. So here we have FZ in relation to all, it's suggesting it's having a difficult time communicating with O1 and a little bit over here with O2, but mostly O1. And again, O1 is having problems communicating with FZ. So it's a mutual problem. That seems to be the only ones that are showing up that way. When we look at the traumatic brain injury discriminant analysis, we see that she fits solidly in the bell curve of the TBI group. So this is the bell curve developed from a known group of TBI individuals, and she's right in there. Her discriminant score is 0.50. The probability that she's had a TBI and has lingering findings related to that is 99%, although the severity index is not too bad at 2.51, which is good. It's good that it's that low. So then we're not done, because just because we've looked at the linked ear display doesn't mean we've found out every bit of information that we need. So let's go back and change our montage to the Laplacian montage. Now with the Laplacian montage, we can see more precisely what's going on and where the abnormal patterns are. Now this is not eye movement artifact. This is delta activity at F4. And so we've got some pretty abnormal wave patterns at F4. They're not related to eye movement. If this was eye movement, we would see it at F3, we would see it at FP1 and FP2, we would see it at F7 and F8, but we don't. It's just happening right in here. If we look at other, the longitudinal bipolar montage, for example, we see a field where it occurs at FP2, F4, F4, C4, C4, P4. We see it a little to a lesser degree. We see it here at FZ and CZ a little bit, but mostly we see it here at these combinations that include F4. We also see it at F8 and T4. So what we mean by a field is that we see it in multiple combinations that are not including the focus of the problem. Let's go back to Laplacian. Let's run our report. The same report, except that we can't do the TBI discriminant, so it's going to give us an error. And here we are. Let's save these. And now we're going to call these ECLP, eyes closed Laplacian. And we can look at that in our display. So let's go to the end of this eyes closed, linked ears. There's the Laplacian. So this is getting rid of the effect of the reference, the ear reference. And so if we go to the statistical maps, we see that this whole right side is affected by this impact injury that she sustained. And we're seeing that it runs up again throughout the frequencies up to about 21 hertz or so. There's a little bit of activity showing up at FZ and P3 and PZ here. But mostly it's this slow activity on the right side that shows impairment. Now, by self-report, she has difficulty with cognition. She has fuzzy thinking. She has migraine headache, persistent migraine headache. She has constant vertigo, and so has a lot of findings that correspond with this activity that we're seeing here. As we go through this, we see very much the same findings. Curious to see if the peak frequency values are a little bit more accurate. So here we have at 01 -2 standard deviations in terms of the peak alpha frequency. And again, we have several that are at -1 standard deviation or better, which is as it should be from our analysis. And our burst amplitude and burst duration. So again, we have findings that are consistent with the person's self-report and also with what we see in the visual inspection. So let's open the NeuroGuide eyes open recording because we want to see if that correlates. So this is our eyes open recording, and we do the same thing with this that we did before. We find an appropriate scale, and we change our display time to 10 seconds. So here we've got some muscle artifact in the forehead. We've got muscle artifact in these frontal sensors and in these lateral frontal sensors at F7 on the left side. And that persists pretty much throughout the recording, unfortunately, which means anything we get from this is going to be skewed by this artifact. So this isn't real EEG, this is just artifact. And we're seeing it at F3 and at F7, so it's on the left side primarily, but we also see it at FP1. And as you can see, it goes through the entire recording and doesn't ever go away. And except when she closes her eyes. So this is a brief period where she kind of gets sleepy and closes her eyes, and of course then the muscle artifact goes away. But we also get this alpha rhythm showing up. So when we go back to the eyes open recording, it's a pretty useless recording, except when she gets sleepy and closes her eyes. As we can see, it happens more frequently as time goes on. So we could, let's just use the automatic method for editing. Just to get some data. And so it's picked out some data, but it's not, it's not really clean data. Actually, it's picked out the data when she was sleeping, unfortunately, mostly. So, yeah, it's picking out the sleep EEG. And so if we were to run maps on this, then what we're going to get is just the effect of this muscle artifact. And so what we want to be careful with is always to look at the raw tracing and never go from the raw tracing right to the statistical maps, because you might go to the statistical maps and say, oh my goodness, this person has this excess fast activity up here, all the way up to 30 hertz, but she really doesn't. She just has muscle artifact. And the nice thing is that it goes away when she gets sleepy, and so that's another way we can determine that it's not a sensor artifact or some other artifact, that it's really a muscle artifact. So we really can't use this data from the eyes open recording. We could open a different EEG, however. We could open the that's right, that's the one that doesn't have the export folder. Do I keep choosing the same one? It does seem like neither one of them has an export folder. Anyone? Actually, I was looking for that one that was the test folder. Where was that one? There we go. There we go. Here we go. So this is a biotrace file. There's our sample John. We're going to call this eyes open because it looks like it's eyes open. Yes, let's set the patient age at 55. Okay, so let's change our time scale. So, and let's use automatic editing, although I wouldn't usually use automatic editing, but just for, we're going to set our sensitivity at very high. And we've got 5 minutes of good data according to this, but as you can see, it's picked out this part of this eye movement artifact. So that's one of the difficulties with, even with the sensitivity setting at high, it still tends to pick up the lateral, the tail end of the lateral or vertical eye blink artifact. And so it's not quite as sensitive as I would like. But I'm going to let that go so that we can just do some assessment of this eyes open. Now, we've got a muscle artifact here at T4, as you can see. It's right here in the middle. That's a muscle artifact. It kind of goes away toward the end. Now it's intermittent. So this is where, when you're doing the recording, you'd be watching this and you'd be telling the client to relax their jaw. Again, we've included a lot of eye blink artifact here that we should not have included because there's not any need for it, because there's a lot of data here. It's just lots and lots and lots and lots of eye blink artifact. So we're going to clear that, and we're going to do the template method instead. So we'll pick some data that does not have any eye blinks in it. And we've got 10 seconds. We're going to edit. And we're going to use the template method and generate edits. So now we've got 1 minute and 11 seconds. So hopefully it's done a better job of eliminating all those eye movement artifacts, which it looks like it has. Yes, it has actually done a very nice job of doing that. Yep. Okay. Of which there is quite a bit. There's also often, no, I guess not. Oops. Okay, so that's good. So let's run a report on that. So this is our sample, John. So we've got deficits from 1 to 3, actually 1 to 5 hertz. So this person is interesting. Let's see what the peak alpha frequency shows us. Coherence is hypo and hypercoherence. Phase lag is excessive. Peak alpha frequency is fast. Delta is fast. Peak alpha frequency is fast. This is an example of may not be a classical example of a low voltage fast pattern, but it's a pretty low voltage fast EEG. If we look at our amplitude marker, we can take a look at see what the voltage is. The voltage of this EEG really doesn't even exceed 5 microvolts most of the time. And the minimum in any literature you ever might want to look at is going to be expecting at least 10 microvolts of EEG. So as I click on this, it shows me the voltage at that moment of the EEG. And none of these, well, this one exceeds 5 microvolts, but they really should exceed at least 10 microvolts, and more appropriately, if it was an eyes closed recording, it should exceed 20 microvolts. But even in an eyes open recording, we should be getting 10 microvolts of EEG, at least somewhere. Here we go. So even these little rhythmic bursts at C3 are showing up as really even, there's one that's just barely close to 10 microvolts, 9.27. So this is a low voltage fast EEG, and this person would be likely to be over-aroused, overactivated, not necessarily have any particular presenting problems, might be a very successful person, but may have some trouble sleeping and resting. This is I'm curious about who this might be. This is the John sample file that comes from Mind Media. So it's somebody over there in Europe is a bit overactivated. So we produce the topographic maps from our assessment, whatever our assessment is, and for example, we have the images from our previous look at the eyes closed recording of that individual. And so then now we have to decide what we're going to do with this person, what kind of training we might want to do. And it's simple. The simple approach is just simply go to these topographic maps and say, okay, let's train the areas that are red. But in this particular case, we've got so many areas that are red that we'd have a hard time knowing where to start. So this person would be a perfect candidate for 19-channel surface or Loretta training, where we would train all of these locations all at the same time, or a certain subset of these locations. And so to facilitate that, let's take a look at how you would do that. The first thing we're going to do is create a symptom checklist match. So we're going to, actually we got to open our other file. We don't want to save that. We want to go to our course example, our eyes closed recording, and we're going to create a symptom checklist map from this recording. This is EC, so we'll save it there. And the program is going to run through all the findings from this analysis, and it's going to create a file that contains all of those findings. And now I can go to, I'm going to just play back this, and I'm going to use this as my file, and I'm going to play it. Then I'm going to go to neurofeedback. I'm going to use Loretta neurofeedback. And I'm going to start out with my symptom checklist that I've just created. The symptom checklist that is a file of all of those findings. And so I go to the symptom checklist and I load it up. And I have the opportunity to compare the client's presenting symptoms with the findings from the EEG that we just did. And so let's say that this person has a bunch of these symptoms. Well, maybe I want to target the networks instead. And I know that this person has some problems with executive function. So I'm going to choose that, and I'm going to increment that by 1. And what I have here is based on the findings from the symptom checklist match file and this choice, these are the findings that I would get. The hypothesis from clicking this executive function choice is that these Brodmann areas on the left and the right should be impacted. So these are what I'm expecting to see. I'm expecting to see findings in these Brodmann areas because they are associated with the executive function network. Now, this column gives me the matches between what I found in my hypothesis and what I found in her actual EEG recording. So if I scroll through here, I see there's a lot of matches. And these are the mismatches. These are the findings that do not match that executive function network. Well, she's got a lot of other issues, but we're not going to address those right away. We're going to stay with this executive function. Or let's say we want to choose a different one. So what other kinds of network issues does she have? She has some memory issues and some emotional regulation issues. So let's see if we get any matches there. Well, we have the hypothesis and all of them match findings that we have from this particular recording. So we could choose that one as well because it matches her symptoms and we get a good match with the hypothesis. We have a difficult time with switching functions, for example. So that's the salience network, switching her awareness from one thing to the next. So again, we have a hypothesis of all these areas should be affected, and in her case, they are affected. So that would be a good choice as well. She's got some working memory issues, so the working memory network, we could choose that. And again, we have lots of matches. And that might be the best choice of all. So let's start with that. So we were working on the working memory network. It is an area that she definitely has. We click OK there. We see that we have chosen 595 metrics. And those metrics are represented over here. Here are the Brodmann areas list. And Brodmann area 7, for example, on the left, we're going to be training delta, theta, alpha, beta, high beta, and alpha 1. And so on. So down the list of Brodmann areas, these are the metrics that have been selected for training. Now, if we wanted to train coherence, we have, again, all of these areas have been selected as between various areas, 7 left and 7 right, for example, in all of these frequencies. If we want to train phase, again, we have those choices, phase shift, phase lock. And so we can make all of these choices and train them differentially. To actually conduct the training, we make a choice about how we're going to show the display. Now we could show the just the basic display. Let's actually try that. I think we've got everything chosen. We've got our Z-score threshold. Let's try the Z-tunes method. And we'll choose the CZ head display method. Now, if we begin session here, what we're going to get is a growing dot in the middle here if the person is able to get z-scores below 2 standard deviations. And they're going to be able to keep that full size as they're able to get those variables above 2 standard deviations and keep them above 2 standard deviations. Now it's still calculating this. Okay, there we go. So we don't expect this person who has a lot of 4 and 5 standard deviations findings to be able to keep that dot full size for much of the time, given the problems that they have. She's actually doing pretty well. If we want to make it more challenging, we're going to lower the z-score threshold. If we want to make it easier, we're going to raise the z-score threshold. So we could raise this to, let's say, 3 standard deviations. We'll get that out of the way so we can see both objects at the same time. And we click apply. It takes a little while to apply that setting. And we're asking her to keep those values below 3 standard deviations now. So now she's going to have, likely going to have an easier time of keeping those values below 3 standard deviations. So that's the simplest. It has nothing to do with the CZ electrode. It's just this is the map that represents this particular training variable. So instead of doing that, let's actually use the multimedia player. And so that gives us this window where we can choose what kind of variables are going to happen, what kind of, and we can set that. We can do a user specified image, for example. Come on. And so we can apply that. And so now we've got a little slideshow showing pictures getting brighter and more dim, and we can change those settings as we like. And make a variety of changes in that. And so those are there are a variety of other things we can do. Multimedia player, Zucore launcher, we can play a couple of Zucore games, and so on. Now, if we don't have this, if we don't have this 19-channel Loretta or Z-score training module, then we could choose to do 2 or 4-channel Z-score training would be what I would be inclined to choose because this person has some pretty serious issues. And so I could choose based on both the person's presenting symptoms and these findings that I might say F7, F8, T5, T6 might be a choice, or F7, F8, T3, T4, or something like that. There are a variety of choices that would get at her memory issues, her vertigo issues, because that would be inclined to be temporal lobe activity. Memory issues would be frontal, so I could address those frontal issues. And so the choices of location is based on a combination of the findings from the assessment and the client's presenting symptoms. So if we understand a little bit about neurophysiology from looking at some of our resources, we can say that, okay, this person has issues with memory and executive function and vertigo, balance, vestibular system issues. Where are those located? And we can go from there and say, okay, these areas should be targeted. We can see that from our coherence measures, we've got kind of a right frontal focus with a left temporal relationship here that seems pretty consistent across multiple frequencies, and therefore that gives us a couple of places that we could train in terms of coherence. So we could train, for example, FP1, FP2 F7, F8. We could include T3 and T4. We could do a lot of combinations with these variables in mind, and they would also all relate to her presenting symptoms. So, I'm going to open this up to questions now for those of you who are left. And if you would like to ask a question, go ahead. Some of you have some audio echo going on through your audio system. So, any questions? If you want to ask a question, you'll have to unmute yourself. I have unmuted you in terms of my control, but you have to individually unmute yourself with the microphone icon in the GoToMeeting menu. Kella?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for that. I'm racking my brain for a question. At the moment, I can't think of one.
No pressure. The other, rather than questions, you could ask about features of the software if you'd like, and I'd be happy to go through some of that. Apparently not.
I do have a question, actually. I had your tech, download things for me or get all of that squared away, and you have the Zucor game button on the ready-made screen, and I do have Zucor games. Is there a link that has to happen in order for them to be connected, or what?
Should not be. It should be. Let's open up Nexus 10. I don't know if I have. I just installed the latest 2017 version, so it may not be, excuse me, in this version. Yeah, I don't have new EEG protocols in this one. Let me see if I can find the one that does. Let's see. So, clicking the Zucor Game Screens button should bring you to the Zucor Game home screen, where you should be able to click one of the buttons and it should launch the program.
Okay, I didn't get a chance to try it. I didn't know if it was an automatic thing.
Yeah, should be.
Or if there needed to be some kind of a link or connection.
No, it should bring you right to the Z-score screen, and they should launch automatically.
That's ZooCore, right? ZooCore
Yep,
game? Okay.
yep. I actually have it in my Nexus 32, not in the Nexus 10, but it works the same. So then it's launched the ZooCore launcher, and then I can choose the game, and that will launch. And so that all should be pretty much automatic.
Okay, very good. That'll be exciting to try. And then you just opened up new,
That's pretty noisy.
what's that? You just opened all those screens, and I'm just used to, I just tried one. I did my first uh, new queue the other day, so that was exciting. Um, when you open up your main screen, there's several. I just opened up the first one, and then there's several others.
So right just now when you opened up you clicked the button for the ZooCore screens?
No, when you open your screens, when you go to what is it, QEEG,
New EEG protocols, yeah.
yes, new EEG protocols, and then you get all of these screens, and then you pick the first one, and that brought up the ones that I remember using in the lab. But then there's all kinds of other screens. Are those additions to that one screen, or are those others?
Hang on a second here. Let's go back to. I just closed that down. So I go to screen browser, I go to new EEG protocols, I open the main screen. So from here,
No, if you go back.
go, oh, I see.
Yeah, so there's all those other ones there.
Um, well, actually, this is even worse.
What does
Let's
that
see.
mean?
It's coming. There we
Okay.
go. Um, it just takes a while to come up. So these are just all screens that I've created over the years. Screen categories,
Well, okay.
screens to show in class, all kinds of screens.
Okay, so go to the new EEG protocols.
Yeah.
Now stop. So the first one, the very first one on the left, that's the one you usually click, but there's other ones.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Well, all of these are the ones. These buttons are linked to the other screens.
Yeah, okay, that's what
So
okay.
all of these screens, this is what the new EEG
Okay,
protocol screens are. Is all these screens.
within that main one.
Yeah, and they're all accessed by this main button menu.
Okay.
So when you click this button, for example, you go to one of those screens that is the SUM1-08 alpha theta training. And so if we go to the SUM, or SUM alphabetical, so SUM1-08, here we go, alpha theta audio, same screen. So it's a kind of a tree structure now. In the new version, of course, you go to the signal library. Well, actually, if you just go back to the main screen, you go to the signal library, then you have all these categories. It's a little bit like how I do it, where you have EEG and then you have the different category buttons, and then that takes you out to multiple other screens. So within the screen category, there are lots of other screens that go to from buttons.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So then the reason why you created the ready-made screens, if you will, was you picked the more prevalent or most popular um, protocols that one could use right away and be able to run with it rather than trying to figure out all the ones that Netflix has available. Is that correct?
Well, ideally, what we're going to be doing in the future is for example, having some of these that are basic screens that will work for just about anything. For example, this single channel 3-band screen will work for any reward and any inhibit combination with a single channel. The thing that Mind Media doesn't have that I have are sort of these weird 2-channel difference in sum training, 2-channel alpha theta training. Their Z-score training is, I don't know how it is in the new version. I haven't had a chance to look at it, actually. That would be worth looking at. Let's look at the new version and see what they've put in there for Z-score training.
One other question that I have is when you open up the screens that you've already created, how do you differentiate between proportional, the proportional audio video, or the video audio? I think that was for the alpha theta. That proportional, you could, where it would soften or go louder versus just full on, tone and are all of your things proportional?
So here's their Z-score. Yeah. So here's their Z-score screen. But it's set up for absolute power and phase instead of using the all Z-score channel, which would be the logical thing to choose, would be the all Z-score channel, but it doesn't use that. So anyway, let's see. So let me look at this one. That's not going to work either. Proportional feedback. So everything, of course, is accessed by a right click. So you have a bar graph that represents something. In this case, the 2-channel alpha theta reward amplitude channel, which, and then you want to reward it by having some sort of feedback. So you right click and you click on feedback options and thresholds. And then you go to, this is chosen for you, but you would choose digitize sound, WAV or MP3. You'd click edit to access that, and then you could put in the files that you wanted, and you could choose to enable volume feedback down here, and then you go to the settings, and this is where you would set the proportional feedback, either direct proportional or inverse proportional. Direct proportional, the level goes up. So if the bar graph goes up, the volume goes up. Inverse proportional, if the bar graph goes up, then the volume goes down. So it's the inverse setting. And then you can set a couple of variables. You can have the volume change related to the Y scale or related to the distance above the threshold.
Okay.
And you can have it fade out a little bit, but so you can still hear it, or completely so you can't hear it at all at the lowest setting.
Okay.
So those are the settings. And so, for example, this 2 to 6 hertz is essentially the same thing, except it's just having the birds chirp when they're above threshold. well, it's all three of these are sound above threshold. So the behavior is above threshold or the behavior is below threshold.
Right. Okay.
However, the proportional volume feedback does not work below threshold. You can set it. You can actually set it to do proportional volume feedback below the threshold, but it doesn't work right. And I don't know why. Although I actually haven't tried it on this new version, so maybe they've got that so that it does work. So then the question would it be louder when it was closer to the threshold but still underneath it, or would it be louder when it was lower and farther below the threshold? So that would be something to choose. I'll have to try that out. Any other questions? Nobody has a question. Okay. So I'm going to stop recording and close the program, close the session, and I will send you an email with the link to download this recording. I know it was really fast, and I know a lot of you were completely lost, but the idea was to pack as much information in as possible so that then you can have it as a resource and review it at your leisure, being able to stop it and go back and see what I did, because I know I just jumped from one menu to the next menu to the next menu without explaining much of anything at all. And that was so that you could see the entire process from beginning to end, and then you can figure it out later, I guess was the idea. So thank you for listening.